Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Tonight we're going to finish reading the first chapter and get into the second chapter a little bit. We've met some interesting characters. A baby named Nobody, an assassin named the man Jack, and a bunch of ghosts. Or are they? So we'll get right into it. Please select the text so you can read along or just listen and enjoy. I have posted an assignment for the first three chapters that will be due on Sunday. So keep up on it so you don't fall behind. We're going to start with the song where we left off yesterday. Sleep, my little baby, oh, sleep until you awaken. When you're grown, you'll see the world, if I'm not mistaken. Kiss a lover, dance a measure, find your name and buried treasure. And Miss Owens sang all that before she discovered that she had forgotten how the song ended. She had a feeling that the final line was something in the way of, and some hairy bacon, but that might have been another song altogether. So she stopped instead. She sang him the one about the man in the moon who came down too soon. And after that, she sang in her warm country voice a more recent song about a lad who had put in his thumb and pulled out a plum. And she had just started a long ballad about a young country gentleman whose girlfriend had, for no particular reason, poisoned him with a dish of spotted eels, when Silas came around the side of the chapel carrying a cardboard box. Here we go, Mistress Owens, he said. Lots of good things for a growing boy. We can keep it in the crypt, eh? The padlock fell off in his hand and he pulled open the iron door. Miss Owens walked inside, looking dubiously at the shelves, at the old wooden pews tipped up against the wall. There were mildewed boxes of old parish records in one corner, and an open door that revealed a Victorian flush toilet and a basin, with only a cold tap on the other. The infant opened his eyes and stared. We can put the food here, said Silas. It's cool and the food will keep longer. He reached into the box and pulled out a banana. What would that be when it was at home? And what would that be when it was at home? Asked Miss Owens, eyeing the yellow-brown object suspiciously. It's a banana, a fruit from the tropics. I believe you peel off the outer covering, said Silas, like so. The child, Nobody, wriggled in Miss Owens' arms, and she let it down to the flagstones, toddled rapidly to Silas, grasped his trouser leg, and held on. Silas passed it the banana. Miss Owens watched the boy eat. Banana, she said dubiously. Never heard of them. Never. What's it taste like? I've absolutely no idea, said Silas, who consumed only one food, and it was not bananas. You couldn't make up a bed in here for the boy, you know. I'll do no such thing. With Owens and me having a lovely little tomb over by the daffodil patch, plenty of room in there for a little one. Anyway, she added, concerned that Silas might think she was rejecting his hospitality, I wouldn't want the lad disturbing you. He wouldn't. The boy was done with his banana. What he had not eaten was now smeared over himself. He beamed, messy and apple-cheeked. Narna, he said happily. What a clever little thing he is, said Miss Owens. And such a mess he's made. Why attend, you little wriggler? She picked the lumps of banana from his clothes and his hair. And then, what do you think they'll decide? I don't know. Can't give him up. Not after what I promised his mamma. Although I have been a great many things in my time, said Silas, I've never been a mother. I do not plan to begin now. But I can leave this place. Miss Owens said simply, I cannot. My bones are here. So are Owen's. I'm never leaving. It must be good, said Silas, to have somewhere that you belong. Somewhere that's home. There was nothing wistful in the way he said this. His voice was drier than deserts, and he said it as if he were simply stating something unarguable. Miss Owens did not argue. You think we will have to wait long? Not long, said Silas, but he was wrong about that. Up in the amphitheater, on the side of the hill, the debate continued that it was the Owenses who had got involved in this nonsense, rather than some flibber gibbet Johnny come latelys counted for a lot. For the Owenses were respectable and respected. That Silas had volunteered to be the boy's guardian had weight. Silas was regarded with a certain wary awe by the graveyard folk, existing as he did on the borderland between their world and the world they had left. But still, the graveyard is not normally a democracy, and yet death is the great democracy, and each of the dead had a voice and an opinion as to whether the living child should be allowed to stay, and they were each determined to be heard that night. It was late autumn when the daybreak was long in coming. Although the sky was still dark, cars could now be heard starting up further down the hill, and as the living folk began to drive to work through the misty night black morning, the graveyard folk talked about the child that had come to them and what was to be done. 300 voices, 300 opinions. Nehemiah Trot, the poet from the tumbled northwestern side of the graveyard, had begun to declaim his thoughts on the matter, although what they were no person listening could have said. And something happened, something to silence each opinionated mouth, something unprecedented in the history of that graveyard. A huge white horse, the kind that the people who know horses would call a gray, came ambling up the side of the hill. The pounding of its hooves could be heard before it was seen, along with the crashing it made as it pushed through the little bushes and thickets, through the brambles and the ivy, and the gorse that had grown up on the side of the hill, the size of the Shire horse. The size of a Shire horse it was, full 19 hands or more. It was a horse that could have carried a knight in full armor into combat, but all it carried on its naked back was a woman, clothed from head to foot in gray. Her long skirt and her shawl might have been spun out of old cobwebs. Her face was serene and peaceful. They knew her, the graveyard folk, for each of us encounters the lady on the gray at the end of our days, and there is no forgetting her. The horse paused beside the obelisk. In the east, the sky was lightening gently, pearlish pre-dawn luminescence that made the people of the graveyard uncomfortable and made them think about returning to their comfortable homes. Even so, not a one of them moved. They were watching the lady on the gray, each of them half excited, half scared. The dead are not superstitious, not as a rule, but they watched her as a Roman augur might have watched the sacred crows circle, seeking wisdom, seeking a clue. And she spoke to them in a voice like the chiming of 100 tiny silver bells. She said only, "The dead should have charity," and she smiled. The horse, which had been contentedly ripping up and masticating a clump of thick grass, stopped them. The lady touched the horse's neck, and it turned, took several huge, clattering steps, and it was off the side of the hill and cantering across the sky. Its thunderous hoofs became an early rumble of distant thunder, and in moments it was lost to sight. That, at least, was what the folks of the graveyard who had been on the hillside that night claimed had happened. The debate was over and ended, and without so much as a show of hands, had been decided. A child called Nobody Owens would be given the freedom of the graveyard. Mother Slaughter and Hosiah Worthington Bart accompanied Mr. Owens to the crypt of the old chapel, and they told Miss Owens the news. She seemed unsurprised by the miracle. "That's right," she said. "Some of them don't have the porth of sense in their head. But she does. Of course she does." Before the sun rose on a thundering gray morning, the child was fast asleep in the Owens' fine little tomb. For Master Owens had died the prosperous head of a local cabinet makers' guild, and the cabinet makers had wanted to ensure that he was properly honored. Silas went out for one final journey before sunrise. He found the tall house on the side of the hill, and he examined the three bodies he found there, studied the pattern of the knife wounds. When he was satisfied, he stepped out into the morning star, his head churning with unpleasant possibilities, and he returned to the graveyard, to the chapel spire where he slept and waited out the days. In the little town at the bottom of the hill, the man Jack was getting increasingly angry. The night had been one that he had been looking forward to for so long, the culmination of months of years of work. And the business of the evening had started so promisingly, three people down before any of them had even had a chance to cry out. And then it had all gone so maddeningly wrong. Why on earth had he gone up the hill when that child had so obviously gone down the hill? By the time he reached the bottom of the hill, the trail had gone cold. Someone must have found the child, taken it in, hidden it. There was no other explanation. The crack of thunder rang out loud and as sudden as a gunshot, and the rain began in earnest. The man Jack was methodical, and he began to plan his next move. The calls he would need to pay on certain of the townsfolk people who would be his eyes and ears in the town. He did not need to tell the convocation he had failed. Anyway, he told himself, edging under a shop front as the morning rain came down like tears. He had not failed, not yet, not for years to come. There was plenty of time to tie up the last piece of unfinished business, time to cut the final thread. It was not until the police siren sounded in the first police car, then an ambulance, then an unmarked police car with the siren blaring sped past him on their way up the hill that, reluctantly, the man Jack turned up the collar of his coat, put his head down, and walked off into the morning. His knife was in his pocket, safe and dry inside its sheath, protected from the misery of the elements. Chapter 2: The New Friend. Bod was a quiet child with sober gray eyes and a mop of tousled mouse-colored hair. He was, for the most part, obedient. He learned how to talk, and once he had learned, he would pester the graveyard folks with questions. Why am why am I allowed out of the graveyard? He would ask, or how do I do what he just did, or who lives in here? The adults would do their best to answer his questions. Their answers were often vague, or confusing, or contradictory. And then Bod would walk down the old chapel and talk to Silas. He would be there waiting at sunset, just as Silas awakened. His guardian could always be counted upon to explain matters clearly and lucidly, as simply as Bod needed in order to understand. You aren't allowed out of the graveyard. It's aren't, by the way, not amped, not these days, because it's only in the graveyard that we can keep you safe. This is where you live, and this is where those who love you can be found. Outside would not be safe for you, not yet. You go outside every night. I am infinitely older than you, lad, and I am safe wherever I am. I am safe there too. I wish that were true. But as long as you stay here, you are safe. Or how could you do that? Some skills can be attained by education, and some by practice, and some by time. Those skills will come if you study. Soon enough, you will master fading and sliding and dream walking. But some skills cannot be mastered by the living, and for those you must wait a little longer. Still, I do not doubt that you will acquire even those in time. You were given the freedom of the graveyard, after all, Silas would tell him, so the graveyard is taking care of you. While you are here, you can see in the darkness. You can walk some of the ways that the living should not travel. The eyes of the living will slip from you. I too was given the freedom of the graveyard, although in my case it comes with nothing but the right of abode. I want to be like you, said Bod, pushing out his lower lip. No, said Silas firmly, you do not. Or, who lies there? You know, Bod, in many cases is written on the stone. Can you read yet? Do you know your alphabet? My what? He shook his head but said nothing. Mr. and Mrs. Owens had never been much for reading when they were alive, and there were no alphabet books in the graveyard. The next night, Silas appeared in the front of the Owens' cozy tomb carrying three large books. Two of them brightly colored alphabet books. A is for apple, B is for ball, and a copy of The Cat in the Hat. He also had a paper and a packet of wax crayons. Then he walked Bode around the graveyard, placing the boy's small fingers on the newest and cleanest of the headstones and the plaques, and taught Bod how to find the letters of the alphabet when they appeared, beginning with the sharp steeple of the capital A. Silas gave Bode a quest to find each of the 26 letters in the graveyard, and Bode finished it proudly with the discovery of Ezekiel Olmsley's stone built into the side of the wall of the old chapel. His guardian was pleased with him. Every day, Bode would take his paper and crayons into the graveyard, and he would copy names and words and numbers as best he could. And each night, before Silas would go off into the world, Bode would make Silas explain to him what he had written, and make him translate the snatches of Latin which had, for the most part, baffled the Owenses. A sunny day, bumblebees explored the wildflowers that grew in the corner of the graveyard, dangling from the gorse and the bluebells, droning their deep, lazy buzz, while Bod lay in the spring sunlight, watching a bronze-colored beetle wandering across the stone of Geo, Reader, his wife Dorcas, and their son Sebastian, Fidelis ad mortem. Bod had copied down their description, and now he was only thinking about the beetle when somebody said, "Boy, what are you doing?" Bod looked up. There was someone on the other side of the gorse bush watching him. "Nothing," said Bod. He stuck out his tongue. The face on the other side of the gorse bush crumpled into a gargoyle, sticking tongue sticking out, eyes popping, and then returned to girl. "That was good," said Bod, impressed. "I can make really good faces," said the girl. "Look at this one." She pushed her nose up with one finger, creased her mouth into a huge, satisfied smile, squinted her eyes, puffed out her cheeks. "Do you know what that was?" "No." "It was a pig, silly." "Oh," Bod thought. "You mean like P is for pig?" "Of course like that. Hang on." She came around the gorse bush and stood next to Bod. He got to his feet. She was a little older than he was, a little taller, and dressed in bright colors, yellow and pink and orange. Bod in his gray winding sheet felt dowdy and drab. "How old are you?" said the girl. "What are you doing here? Do you live here? What's your name?" "I don't know," said Bod. "You don't know your name?" said the girl. "Of course you do. Everybody knows their name. Fibber." "I know my name," said Bod, "and I know what I'm doing here, but I don't know the other thing you said." "How old are you?" "How old you are?" Bod nodded. "Well," said the girl, "that was you. What was you when you was last birthday?" "I didn't," said Bod. "I never was. Everybody gets birthdays. You never had cake or candles and stuff?" Bod shook his head. The girl looked sympathetic. "Poor thing. I'm 5. I bet you're 5 too." Bod nodded enthusiastically. He was not going to argue with his new friend. She made him happy. Her name was Scarlett Amber Perkins. She told him, and she lived in a flat with no garden. Her mother was sitting on a bench by the chapel at the bottom of the hill reading a magazine, and had told Scarlett to be back in half an hour to get some exercise, and not to get into trouble or talk to strangers. "I'm a stranger," pointed out Bod. "You're not," she said definitely. "You're a little boy." And then she said, "You're my friend, so you can't be a stranger." Bod smiled rarely, but he smiled then, hugely and with delight. "I'm your friend," he said. "What's your name?" "Bod. It's short for nobody." She laughed then. "Funny sort of name," she said. "What are you doing?" "ABC," said Bod. "From the stones. I have to write them down." "Can I do it with you?" For a moment, Bod felt protected. The gravestones were his, weren't they? Then he realized how foolish he was being. He thought that there were things that might be more fun done in the sunlight with a friend. He said yes. He copied down names from tombstones, Scarlett helping Bod pronounce unfamiliar names and words, Bod telling Scarlett what the Latin meant, if he already knew. And it seemed much too soon when they had heard a voice further down the hill shouting, "Scarlett!" The girl thrust the crayons and paper back at Bod. "I got to go," she said. "I'll see you next time," said Bod. "Won't I?" "Where do you live?" she asked. Here, he said, and he stood and watched her as she ran down the hill. On the way home, Scarlet told her mother about the boy called Nobody who lived in the graveyard and had played with her. That night, Scarlet's mother mentioned it to Scarlet's father, who said that he believed that imaginary friends were a common phenomenon at that age, and nothing at all to be concerned about, and that they were fortunate to have nature reserves so near. After that initial meeting, Scarlet never saw Bob first. On days when it was not raining, one of their parents would bring her to the graveyard. The parent would sit on the bench and read while Scarlet would wander off the path, a splash of fluorescent green or orange or pink, and explore. Then, always sooner rather than later, she would see a small gray face and gray eyes staring up from her from beneath a mop of mouse-colored hair. Then Bob and she would play hide and seek, sometimes reclining things, or being quiet and watching the rabbits behind the old chapel. Bob would introduce Scarlet to some of his other friends. As she could not see them, it did not seem to matter. She had already been told by her parents that Bob was imaginary, and that there was nothing at all wrong with that. Her mother had, for a few days, even insisted on laying an extra place at the dinner table for Bod, so it came as no surprise to her that Bod also had imaginary friends. He would pass on their comments to her. Bartleby says that thou dost have a face like unto a squished plum, he would tell her. So does he, and why does he talk so funny? Doesn't he mean squashed tomato? I don't think that they had tomatoes where he comes from, said Bod, and that's just how they talk. Scarlet was happy. She was a bright, lonely child whose mother worked for a distant university, teaching people she never met face to face, creating English papers sent to her over the computer, and sending messages of advice or encouragement back. Her father taught particle physics, but there were, Scarlet told Bob, too many people who wanted to teach particle physics and not enough people who wanted to learn. So Scarlet's family had to keep moving to different university towns, and in each town her father would hope for a permanent teaching position that never came. What's particle physics? Asked Bob. Scarlet shrugged. Well, she said, there's atoms, which is things that is too small to see. That's what we're all made of. And there's things that's smaller than atoms, and that's particle physics. Bob nodded and decided that Scarlet's father was probably interested in imaginary things. Bob and Scarlet wandered the graveyard together every weekday afternoon, tracing names with their fingers, writing them down. Bob would tell Scarlet whatever he knew of the inhabitants of the grave or mausoleum or tomb, and she would tell him stories that she had been read or learned. And sometimes she would tell him about the world outside, about cars and buses and television and airplanes. Bob had seen them flying high overhead, had thought them loud silver birds, but had never been curious about them until now. He, in his turn, would tell her about the days when people in the graves had been alive, how Sebastian Reeder had been to London town and had seen the Queen, who had been a fat woman in a fur cap who had glared at everyone and spoke no English. Sebastian Reeder could not remember which queen she had been, but he did not think she had been queen for very long. When was this? Scarlet asked. He died in 1583, it says on his tombstone. So before then, who was the oldest person here in the whole graveyard? Asked Scarlet. Bod frowned. Probably Caius Pompeius. He came here 100 years after the Romans first got here. He told me about it. He liked the roads. So he's the oldest? I think so. Can we make a little house in one of those stone houses? You can't get in. It's locked. They all are. Can you get in? Of course. Why can't I? The graveyard, he explained. I got the freedom of the graveyard. Lets me go places. I want to go in the stone house and make little houses. You can't. You're just mean. Not, meanie, not. Scarlet put her hands into her pocket of her anorak, and walked down the hill without saying goodbye, convinced that Bob was holding out on her, and at the same time suspecting that she was being unfair, which made her angrier. That night, over dinner, she asked her mother and father if there was anyone in the country before Romans. What did you hear about the Romans? Asked her father. Everybody knows, said Scarlet with withering scorn. Was there? There were Celts, said her mother. They were the first. They go back before the Romans. They were the people that the Romans conquered. On the bench beside the old chapel, Bob was having a similar conversation. The oldest, said Silas. Honestly, Bob, I don't know. The oldest in the graveyard that I encountered was Caius Pompeius. There were people here before the Romans came, lots of them, going back a long time. How are your letters coming along? Good, I think. When do I learn joined up letters? Silas paused. I have no doubt, he said after a moment's reflection, that there are among the many talented individuals interred here at least a smattering of teachers. I shall make inquiries. Pod was thrilled. He imagined a future in which he could read everything, in which all stories could be opened and discovered. When Silas had left the graveyard to go about his own affairs, Pod walked to the willow tree beside the old chapel and called Caius Pompeius. All right, everyone. My son's about to cry, and so I think I'm going to have to call it. Have a lovely evening. Take care of yourselves and your families. Keep reading. Thanks for coming.